Welcome to the Freshman Foundation Podcast, helping you make the jump from high school athletics to the collegiate level and beyond, with your host, Michael Huber.
How is Carrie Jackson helping athletes build the mental skills necessary to rebound from injuries? Unfortunately, injuries are a part of the athletic experience. Many athletes go to great lengths to recover physically after a serious injury. However, the psychological recovery from injury may be more elusive. My guest on this episode, Carrie Jackson, is a certified mental performance consultant and expert on the psychology of injury. Carrie is the co-author of Rebound, Train Your Mind to Bounce Back Stronger from Sports Injuries. In episode 23, Carrie talks about her experiences working with injured athletes and teaching the mental skills necessary to cope effectively during injury rehabilitation. She also discusses the impact of injuries on high school athletes going through the college recruiting process and the transition to the next level of athletics. I'm excited for this conversation. Let's build your foundation with Carrie Jackson. Hey, Carrie, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for coming on to the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So for those listening to the podcast that don't know you, could you just talk a little bit about your background and how you got into mental performance coaching?
Yeah. So I've been in the field for, 20 years now, almost 20 years, I think. And so originally I was studying psychology. So I always knew I wanted to work with people with human behavior. And I was fascinated with the brain and human behavior. And I thought I wanted to be a therapist. I had no idea I would move into the world of mindset training and sports psychology. So I graduated, and literally as I was walking across the stage for my undergraduate, I realized, I don't think I'm supposed to be a therapist. So now what do I do? And I ended up, like any lost, newly graduated student, I ended up moving to Tahoe, to South Lake Tahoe, to pursue my own sports. So at that time, I was big into rock climbing and snowboarding. Those were my main sports. And so I just kind of got a chance to go dive into those a little deeper and try to figure out what I wanted to do. And during that time was recognizing my own psychology and the psychology of my friends in those same sports. And but it wasn't until my mom brought home a brochure for a sports psychology program, a master's program, because she knew I wanted to continue my education. And she brought home a brochure, she sent it to me. Brought it home there and then sent it to me. And she said, I saw this and I thought you'd be interested. And I was like, what is this? What is this amazing field of study that I've never heard of? And so I went to the next open house and signed up, and the rest was history.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
That's great. Oh my gosh. It's so
I can relate to that for sure. So obviously you have a very specific interest in injuries and the sports psychology of injury. Is there anything like what brought you to that point? Did you have any experience, or what got you interested?
Yeah. So actually it was really interesting that my very initial sort of interest in it was personal, as it often is. And before I came into my studies in graduate school in sports psychology, I had arthroscopic knee surgery. So I had a knee injury, and I had a really hard time coming back from that, like regaining my confidence and trusting my knee after that injury, and really struggled with the recovery and pain management. It just was a big challenge. And it was my first major injury and the first time kind of navigating that whole process. And then fast forward a few years, and I injured that same knee again, different injury, but I was in the middle. I was had just finished. I was in the second year of my graduate studies, I believe, when it happened, or it was right in the middle of it. And it's almost as soon as the injury happened. So it was just a fluke injury during snowboarding, and as they strapped me into like the sled to take me down the mountain, almost immediately I was like, okay, I'm going to use everything that I'm learning and apply it to injury. And now my recovery is my sport, and everything I'm doing or was doing for my sport, now I need to apply to my recovery. And so I can't even tell you the difference between my comeback from the first injury and the second injury was profoundly different, like just phenomenally different in a way where I was like, oh my gosh, how are we not giving these skills and these tools to everybody for injury? And so that was a big catalyst for me. And then in the beginning of my career, I had the opportunity because of the sport that I was specializing in. I was specializing in cycling at the time. You just end up working with a lot of people that are coming back from crashes and coming back from injury. And so then I got the opportunity to apply what I had done to myself to other people and realized, oh yeah, okay, this is a big deal.
Yeah. So with the second injury, was it just sort of an epiphany like that you had when you were going through it? Like as you're coming to them out, you're thinking like, I'm going to do it differently this time around?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I knew immediately that I was going to apply, like I was going to do it differently. And I was going to really take all this mental training that I was learning about how to apply to optimal performance for healthy athletes and apply it to myself in the injury setting. So it was like, okay, so how do I take self-talk and apply it here? How do I take visualization and apply it here? And goal setting and all of those things. And was like, I'm going to, let's really do this. And I came back and had my best season ever. It was incredible.
Well, that's right. You ran your own qualitative mini experiment.
Right? I know. N of one.
That's a mini study, right? N of one, exactly. But I mean, if you think about the sports psychology concepts, right? The first time you sort of looked at something, that was out of your control and it was a threat, and then you took it into your control and said, hey, this is what I can be responsible for, control the controllables, and using that as a tool for growth. And that's an amazing thing, right? And if we can pass that on to other athletes, certainly there's, it makes it, helping others is something that's really important to me. And it sounds like it is to you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a tough, with injury in particular, what was so neat for me to go through was like, I immediately was trying to figure out how can this be an opportunity? And that's not something you usually think when you get injured. And that's a big sort of philosophy I have in Rebound, the book, and the Injured Athletes podcast is that, okay, so I would prefer not to be injured very strongly, but I am. So how can I use this as an opportunity for growth? And it's pretty amazing what you can do when that happens. Cause I've worked with so many athletes now through the injury process. And when they apply their mental training there, then that you have built those tools that are going to continue to serve you once you're back in your sport, or if you have to transition out of sport. So it's just a win-win all around.
Yeah. But can you talk about that? Because I would imagine that there are plenty of athletes who, when you start working with them and you sort of present this approach or philosophy, they're skeptical. I mean, can you talk about sort of different types of reactions you get from athletes when you first start working them about treating injury like an opportunity for growth versus this being really being a threat?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're right. Like there are a lot of different reactions, and a lot of it has to do with timing, right? So if I come at, if I'm approaching an athlete who's just been injured and is devastated and trying to figure out, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my career? What does this mean for my season? And I'm like, hey, don't worry, dude. It's an opportunity. I'd be like, oh, really? Is it? Because it doesn't feel like it, Carrie. It does not feel like it at all, right? So timing is a big factor. So, within this idea of working with athletes through their injury process, you really have to honor what they're going through. And it is devastating. And it's a huge blow to what you thought your season was going to look like, right? And a huge blow to your athletic identity. So that part, you kind of have to honor that first. And then as you start opening up your opening up yourself to the experience and working through it and doing the mindset training and the mental training. And then that's when they're ready to start to look at the possibility that maybe I can come back from this even stronger. And maybe this could be something that actually is really good. Like I like the idea of if you step back and look at the bigger picture and look at, it's like taking Joseph Campbell's mythology idea of the hero's journey. And if you step back and look at your journey as an athlete, you're still on this big journey. And right now you just happen to be injured, and that's part of your journey. And if you're lucky enough to be an athlete for long enough, there's a good chance it'll be part of your journey. Maybe not, but for a lot of us, it is at some point. And so how do we start to wrap our heads around seeing how we can get through that part of your hero's journey, of your injury or of your athletic journey with resilience and with a growth mindset, instead of feeling like this is the worst thing that could have ever happened to me. It's not, it sucks. Injuries suck. There's no getting around that, but it's not the worst thing that's ever happened. You might actually come out the other side feeling grateful for it.
Right. So in my work, because so much of my focus is with, adolescent, high school to college population, what I see in my limited experience with injured athletes is it's much harder to get them to see the big picture, particularly when you've got the target being, oh, I want to get a college scholarship.
Yeah.
And there's such a limited amount of time that they have, to your point, timing, such a limited amount of time that they have to prove their worth, especially if they don't have a commitment or, to have a scholarship offer. I find it's really hard to sort of console them but how help them see the bigger picture. I mean, have you had those types of experiences in that age group?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a few different things I see in particular that are unique to the high school athlete going through, and especially in that transition to college and thinking about being a collegiate athlete. And it does feel like those years in particular, when you feel like you're, when you're starting to get recruited and thinking about where am I going to be going, it can feel like a huge blow to be injured during that time. And so, and then also, just that it feels like a lot of pressure. So a lot of those athletes that I've worked with in that like high school to college transition, when they're injured during that time, is just feeling like I've lost my opportunity and and nobody's going to want me now. And what does this mean for me? And just putting so much pressure on themselves. And the sort of the dangerous thing with that is the possibility of pushing too hard too soon and not allowing your body to recover so that you do come back 100%. Because let me tell you, those college coaches don't want you at 80%. They want you at 100%. So they want you to take the time to recover as much as you like, as much as I do, as much as you do, Michael. So it just, but it's hard when you are feeling that pressure. The other pressure I think that they feel too sometimes is just feeling like they need to be there for their team, and feeling guilty for being injured and not being able to contribute. And so to let that go too, that's a big thing that people go through. But really, when I kind of coach people through that process of if they're injured and they were in the middle of that recruitment process, those coaches, I'll encourage the athletes to connect with them and let them know how their recovery is going, because they want to see you're taking your recovery seriously, and that you're embracing that mindset of okay, my recovery is now my sport, and all of the energy I was putting into my sport, I'm putting it on my recovery. And so the coach feels confident that I'm coming back 100%. And so it's okay if you're not on the field. It's okay if you're not on the court. They want to see that you're working and not working, not overdoing it, because that's going to be a red flag for them too. Is this person going to be healthy throughout their college career? They want to know that you can, that you're able to do that. So there's a few kind of unique things that are always on my mind if I'm working with a high school injured athlete.
Yeah. Because I've worked with a few who've actually had some fairly significant injuries. And the issue I've seen with them is they're playing through the injury and delaying some sort of treatment, because if they were committed, it'd be different, right? I have a commitment. Yeah. I have a scholarship offer. That's not going away. I'm going to just, I'm going to get fixed and that's going to be it. But if I don't have a commitment, they'll say I'll just play through pain. And they're torturing themselves to play through these injuries with a massive amount of pain, because they feel like if I get the surgery, that's going to be the end of my recruitment process. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah. Yeah. And it really, that's where we're also looking at a bigger sort of cultural shift in terms of this idea that has been romanticized of playing through the pain. If you're a real team player, and if it meant enough to you, and if you're, passionate enough about your sport and you want it bad enough, you're going to play through the pain, which is such a dangerous and horrific precedent to set. And that's a big sort of part of our goal, is to flip the script on that, because it's not, then you get athletes that end up not being able to play at all because they've pushed their body too hard too soon, or they haven't allowed themselves to heal, and are now dealing with a chronic injury instead of an injury that you could have healed from. So, but it's tough when you want something so badly and aren't able to see that bigger picture and trust that you are going to come back. It just, you gotta give yourself time to do it.
Yeah, I think that's an important word, right? Trust in the process, and knowing that if you do put in the work and you put yourself in the right position from a recovery perspective, you're going to get back to where you want to be. But there's just so much fear about the unknown a lot of times that it's, they just, a lot of athletes just don't want to look at it in the face, or they're in denial about what they have to or want to do or need to do to get back to where they were.
Yeah.
You did mention some of the types of things, like in passing, like the types of techniques and skills that you would work with an injured athlete on, but can you talk about that a little bit more? And how do you go about developing programs for individual athletes based upon what you're seeing and assessing?
Yeah. So, I wrote a whole book on it.
I know you did.
Right. So, I
have it right here.
Nice. Oh, nice. Yeah. So I still have other tools that it didn't get to make it into the book, but like that book is so full of mental training tools that you can do to impact yourself and help yourself through this recovery process. So, there's just so many different, there's so many different ways that you can help yourself through the process, and so much research that shows that the athletes that do the mental training during their injury recovery have it helps with having positive outcomes. But just for so long, we've only thought about injury as a physical process and a physical rehabilitation, and just haven't, even though you ask any injured athlete if part of their recovery is mental, and they'll tell you 100%, we just have not given people the tools to be able to know how to have a mental recovery and mental rehabilitation. So in the book, there's all different kinds of ways to, all different types of mental training tools to help you through that process. So part of it kind of depends on where you're at in your recovery, right? Like where you're at in the injury process. And, but I have a couple favorites. I have so many favorites. I don't know. But, one actually fun one that I love to do, is, it's sort of along positive affirmations, but the way you do it is we call them random reminders. And so in your phone, you grab your phone and you go to your reminders and you write down like a positive affirmation. And then you just like spin the date, like you would spin the Price is Right wheel, which I totally, half your audience is not going to know what I'm talking about, but like you spin the wheel, right? So on the date, and it just lands on a random date. So you don't know when it is. And I'll put in like 5 to 10 at a time in my phone, and then just spin the wheel, and they all have different dates. And then you'll be amazed at like the timing of some of these things when this message pops up and you're like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I needed to hear. And so that's a really fun one to like make sure you're getting those positive messages of encouragement. So that I really like that one. And then another one I really like, I was just working on this with one of my clients, is it's sort of a framework for if you're feeling hooked by like you're feeling overwhelmed or you're feeling stressed and you're sort of feeling hooked, a way to hit the pause button so that you can regroup. So it gives you a framework to do it. So it's the template, it's like a fill in the blank. And so the template is, I am feeling blank because I'm focused on blank, right? So you fill in the blank. You're like, okay, I'm feeling overwhelmed because I'm focused on how far I have to go in my recovery. And then the next one is, I want to feel blank, so I'm going to focus on blank, right? So it's I want to feel confident, so I'm going to focus on, contacting my PT and asking what the next step is, whatever it is, like it helps you to make that shift into something that's in your control, but it gives you a template for it where it's like, because your brain is in overdrive trying to, in those moments. So to first hit the pause button and then give yourself a template for the mindset shift is a nice tool that I really like using too.
Right. It's almost like an exercise to shift from emotion focused coping to problem focused coping.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Very cool. I love the roulette one. It always amazes me what people in our field are able to come up with in terms of developing creative interventions that are fun and that will have a much higher probability of sticking.
Yes.
And it's something that I'm constantly working on because it doesn't necessarily come natural to me. So I love to hear that. That sounds really, really cool.
It's such a big part of our job to translate it into something that's sticky and like fun and something that you'll actually do.
Yeah. Now, I know from some of my work, the research out there about, how the psychology of the athlete impacts the probability of re-injury, right? So obviously there's a recovery phase of this, but ultimately the athlete will recover, right? The body will recover in almost all instances and they'll go back onto the field. So once they've recovered, like, what does that look like in terms of like, okay, now they're back on the field and they may be having some doubt, even though they're 100% physically
cleared.
Able, right?
Yeah.
So like, what does that look like for you when you're working with an athlete?
Yeah, that's where during that particular phase, sometimes what I'll see is there might be some hesitation or self-selection out of certain things because it's like your confidence or your mental training needs time to catch up to the physical recovery, right? So there's still some mental recovery and you're physically there, but your confidence isn't there yet and needs to kind of catch up. And so when that happens, then there might be other tools that I'm working on with an athlete to help with that catch up. And part of it depends on what's happening. So part of it might be, if it's fear of re-injury and not trust, then there's specific tools we might be working on. If it's not trusting your body, which is similar but a little bit different than fear of re-injury, like there might be certain tools we're focusing on. If it's fear that you're not going, that you've lost fitness and you're not in the same place as your teammates, then there's other tools that we might be working on. So first it's kind of assessing like, well, what is the hesitation? Like, where's the gap and what's causing the gap? And then that helps us figure out, okay, now what do we need to address how we're defining success, or do we need to address some tools for managing anxiety to kind of quiet the protective mechanism of that fear of re-injury? So it's, so it kind of depends on what's happening for the athlete in that moment.
Right. So, basically like any other athlete, you're developing a custom intervention based upon what you're identifying as being the issues, based upon the personality of the athlete, the way they learn, all those things, right? So it's not like a one size fits all, like, hey, here's a program for, mental skills training through injury. It's not necessarily how it's going to work.
No. Yeah. There's definitely a lot of things that you'll see that I see athletes struggle with across the board. Okay. And I even have like a sort of an online coaching program, like a support group. Because one of the things that's really helpful too is support and getting support through the process. And that's something that we see as a buffer against stress. So it's a significant part of what I encourage people to do too. So there are things that, most athletes will, but that being said, everybody's still unique in both in their injury and their experience with injury and what it is that's sticking with them this time. Because sometimes it's really interesting. I'll work with athletes that they're like, I don't understand what's happening. The first time I had an injury, I was fine. I came back. It was incredible. I wasn't afraid of getting injured at all. I don't understand what's happening. And it's really confusing to them. So it's, even with an athlete, it might be unique to themselves in one injury to the next. And so it's, there definitely isn't, although I'll see things across the board that many athletes will struggle with, the way that I work with that person and what's going to click with them might be different. And so it's, you kind of can't do a cookie cutter program because of that.
Absolutely. And what that makes me think of is sort of in the context of, this podcast's, purpose and theme is, an athlete might get injured in high school and not think twice about it, right? But then I go to college and the circumstances are different, or the pressure is higher, or whatever, like there's more, there's greater stakes. And all of a sudden what was something that they dealt with routinely the first time. The second time, it's completely different, even though it may be a similar injury, a similar scope and severity, but they're in this, much more competitive environment where the psychological and physical demands are much greater. I mean, is that kind of an example of something that you might see?
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I'll see too is just with some athletes, it might depend on the type of injury it is too, and whether or not it increases their feeling of vulnerability. And so that's that's a piece where just your brain is wired to protect your body, and so
Sure.
if it kind of goes into overdrive in that protective mode, it can be hard to come back out of that. And so you need some mental training tools to throw a wrench in that feedback loop to get yourself out of that protective sort of mode. But yeah, that's definitely something that I'll see.
I don't think I was thinking about this when I was preparing or planning to ask you, but I am curious, like, can you talk about like how you help, say, parents of athletes or the dynamic within a family when it comes to major injuries? Because obviously, like, it's not just the person who's injured, it affects the people around them, especially when there's a significant consequence, like a potential financial consequence, right? If it comes to being a professional athlete or going to college and having a scholarship and all those things. Like, what are your experiences like that in that space?
Yeah, with parents, part of it again, it's so unique too with parents and sort of what the injury is and the family dynamics and there's a lot of different things that can happen there. But one thing that parents are concerned with is like, sometimes they'll see that their child is cleared to play, but still holding back. And so they know that it's the mental piece that's holding them back and they don't know how to help. And so that, oftentimes that's when I'm getting contacted by parents, is during that piece. And they feel a little helpless about what to do. So, so sometimes I'll get on, one of my sessions might be meeting with the parents, or it might be meeting with the parents and the physical therapist, to help, provide similar language to everybody and kind of give a context of what's happening with that sort of the mental piece and how they can reinforce some of that. But yeah, just as much as athletes need to kind of pull back and not put pressure on themselves, parents need to do the same thing, because it's only going to get in the way of the athlete being able to get back as healthy as possible as soon as possible. Yeah. So really sort of just honoring that, honoring the body and honoring the time it takes in order to make that happen. And you can't rush it. And if you do, it does not always work out in your favor and it's not worth it. So it just, so kind of the parents trusting that process too, and trusting the healthcare providers that are there working with your kids. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't do a lot of work in the injury space, but that's my experience just in terms of performance, and in terms of parents who come to me and say like, I'm sort of at my wit's end. I don't know how to help my child. Like, can you help them? And I would imagine that in that, right, when you're feeling helpless about what your child can do. And what I find, and I'm curious as to whether you see this, what I'm finding in my work just on the performance side is the parents sometimes are they're under more duress than the athlete. And then when the athlete and I talk to them, because they have more control over the situation, right? Like either they're not viewing it as such a big deal, or maybe they're on the same page, but the athlete has control because now we're dealing one-on-one and parents are outside the circle. So like my experience is that sometimes parents can actually, for lack of a better way to put it, make things worse.
Yes. And not meaning to, right?
No, of course not. Of course, they want the best for the child.
Yeah. But like, it is interesting that in some ways, like, I might be encouraging the parents to work on their own sort of anxiety management because you're so right. Like the parents are going through their own experience and then the athlete's also going through an experience and then they're going through a combined experience. So and we forget that sometimes that like each person in that is going through their own personal thing that's going on. And then how do you help each other in that space when you're triggered, and don't know what to do? Or, I think, any parent of any teenager out there is going to recognize like it's also just a challenge to be the parent of a teenager, let alone an athlete, let alone an injured athlete. So, it's one of the things you've probably heard this too, Michael, like one of the things I'll hear sometimes like from parents is like, Carrie, I told them the exact thing that you did. Like, but they did it. I told them all of these things, and I was like, I know, but it's different because they're not going to hear it when it's coming from you, but they'll hear it coming from me. And they're like,
we talk about that. I talk about that all the time with parents.
Yeah.
And what I'm finding is that, at least, and maybe it's just a coincidence, but what I find is I'm coming across many more parents now that I feel like understand that dynamic, like to the point where they're like, you know what? I know my child is not going to listen to me as much as I try. And I know that somebody on the outside has not invested emotionally is going to be able to help. And so I'm willing to step aside and have someone else help them, which I think is great, because I think in the past, and maybe it's just a function of the times in terms of our understanding of mental health, maybe it's just financial means too, right? Like if you have the financial means, it's a lot easier to say, hey, I'm going to invest in mental skills coaching for my athlete because I can part with the disposable income versus if you don't have that, it's much harder and more stressful. And so, but I think it is great that parents are stepping forward and saying like, hey, I don't know if I could do this, but being a parent of a teenager is hard because I am one. But I did want to spend a little time as we sort of move towards wrapping up on identity, right? You mentioned identity. It's such a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
And the way athletes look at themselves and they put so much of their identity is formed in being an athlete. And then when we get injured and we're not able to do the thing that we're most identifying ourselves with or what we think other people see us as, there can be obviously a negative mental health consequence. I mean, can you talk about like what you see there in terms of really helping athletes to sort of see the bigger picture in terms of like who they are as people and their identity?
Yeah, it's a really significant one for all ages, which is interesting. But like one of the things to recognize with your high school athletes is, where I see the biggest impact and why this is really important for sort of parents and coaches to tune into also is that if you are the coach or a parent of an athlete that has a high athletic identity and a significant amount of their self-worth comes from their athletic identity, and then they get injured, that's where you have real potential for mental health issues and, increased risk of anxiety and depression and consequences from the emotional impact of not being able to participate in your sport when you have high athletic identity and high self-worth wrapped up in that. So there's a couple things that you're doing. One is to really, outside of being injured, or just in general, to be talking to your kids and the athletes that you're coaching about different aspects of their identity. And that this is, I had an athlete that I was working with, he put it so eloquently. He said, his sport is triathlon. And he's like, triathlon isn't who I am, it's what I do. So he has a very good grasp on what it means in his life. And it's important to him, and he's a professional triathlete, but it's not his end all be all. He has other things as well, and sort of recognizing that. And so being able to help your kids recognize that too, that you're more than just an athlete. That's what you do, and it's part of who you are. It's not all of who you are. And you're still, an incredible, worthy person outside of that. And so that's really important. And then the other piece is to help them recognize too, you're still an athlete. And so that's why that concept is really sticky with my athletes, that and I'll say those words, I'll say that you're still an athlete, and now your recovery is your sport, and everything you were doing in order to perform to your potential, on the field or on the court, you now need to do for your recovery. So you're, because the thought process is that if I can't do the thing, I'm not the thing, right? If I can't do my sport, I'm not an athlete. That's not true. You are still an athlete, and you need to take that athlete mindset and apply it to your recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. One of my former guests or prior guests was a college football player, a very high level, Division I. He injured his back very severely. He was forced to retire before he finished his college career. His dream was to play professional football. And ultimately that led to him becoming depressed, addicted, and ultimately he tried to commit suicide. And in the podcast, he talks about how when he found another purpose, right? When he found something bigger than sport, that's when he started to make an emotional recovery and started to be able to shift his thinking. And I think what you just said is so important, right? Like there's so many elements of a person, and there's so much in our society tied up in, I'm going to be an athlete. Like I'm an athlete, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to be a pro, I'm going to do this. And when it doesn't happen, we're so results oriented. We can't get off the fact that we didn't achieve what we said or thought we were going to achieve. Right. So it's so important to be talking to them about, hey, do you have other things that you like to do? Do you have friends like this? I mean, there's a very few athletes in the world who could put all the eggs in one basket and be able to cope with the pressure that comes with that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And as parents, you can think about too, am I modeling that? Right? Because we can get wrapped up in that too, of like over identifying as a parent in your career, whatever it is. Like if most of your self-worth is wrapped up in, significantly more in one area of your life, to kind of think about, well, how can I also be a role model for this? And be able to broaden my own idea of that I'm worthy outside of any one aspect of myself.
Yeah. So I guess the last phase in the progression is we get athletes who ultimately are forced to transition out of sport because of injury. So can you talk about what that's like when you come across those types of athletes? Because obviously that can be really traumatic.
Yeah. There's two different ways I see that present itself. And one is it's actually not because of the physical injury, but because they can't get a handle on their nerves. And so they feel forced out because of that. So there's two things that I'll see. So that's one. And one thing we'll talk about is like, so sometimes that will happen is it's a natural thing to happen for some athletes when you're injured to question whether or not you want to come back. And so so one of the things we'll do is we'll still do the mental training and get you mentally and physically ready to come back, so that then you get to decide and feel like you made the decision instead of the decision being made for you. So it's a nice way to kind of shift the perception of control. And some athletes will be like, I just needed to get a handle on my nerves and I don't want to quit. And then others get a handle on, they're like, you know what? I think it's just, I'm ready and I feel good about this. So if you, without that process, you might feel like you're being forced out because you just can't get a handle on your nerves and on the mental piece. So then there's also people that are feel forced out because the physical injury is one that won't allow you to go back to that particular sport or to any sport. It might be catastrophic injury that affects not just your sport, but your life. And so, and that's a whole kind of transitional process in and of itself of what does this mean now, not only for who I am as in my athletic world, but who I am in my life. And so just, what's interesting is, on the Injured Athletes Club podcast, I've had the opportunity to, interview so many amazing athletes and talk about their stories and time and again, whether it's an injury that was a catastrophic injury that changed their entire life, or an injury that was a really significant injury, but they were able to go back to their sport in the way that they did. It's so amazing. Time and again, athletes independent of each other will say, I never would wish this on anybody, and I wouldn't necessarily want to go through it again, but I'm so grateful I went through it because it opened doors and opportunities to me. And I learned things that I never would have been able to had I not gone through that experience. So again, that's something that they weren't able to see until the other side. But I feel like if we share enough of those stories, then people who are in that position might start to have some hope that maybe that means that I can do that too.
Yeah. It's so important. So as we finish up, if you had to give one piece of advice to an athlete who was injured, what would it be?
I think part of it is to reach out for support and find your support system so that you're not alone. It can feel very isolating when you're injured. It can be really painful to feel like everyone else is out there, doing the sport that I love and I'm not able to be there. So to really think about, well, what can I do to help provide support for myself. If you're, if you're on Facebook, we have an Injured Athletes Club support group, or even just listening to other stories, through the Injured Athletes Club podcast, so that you can feel like you're connecting with other people and know that you're 100% not alone. And there's other people out there that get it and get what you're going through and get how important this is to you. And just, I think that's probably the biggest thing is reaching out for support.
And for parents, what's one piece of advice you might give to a parent of an injured athlete?
Yeah, I think, providing the space to allow them to talk about how they're feeling, right? And just like without judgment, without responding, just sort of holding the space, which can be challenging to do sometimes, but just like, and sometimes they might not be ready or willing to share with you, but as much as you can, like, letting them talk about their recovery and letting it come from them. Just like, so, how did it feel in physical therapy today? Like, what'd you guys work on and how are you feeling about your injury today? So not, kind of making it really specific. Cause if you just ask like, well, how are you feeling about your injury? It can feel overwhelming, but like, how are you feeling about your injury today? You can allow them to talk about what they're feeling right now in this moment.
Yeah, that's great advice. I know how hard it can be to be a parent of a young athlete, let alone one that's going through an injury, something that's largely out of our control. So those bits of advice are really helpful, I think, for our audience. So I just want to thank you, Carrie, for coming on the podcast. It was great to see you.
Yeah,
it's
you
been
too.
a while. And just, check out Carrie's book. She mentioned it here, Rebound, Train Your Mind to Bounce Back Stronger from Sports Injuries, and the Injured Athletes Club podcast. So again, Carrie, thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
All right. Take care. What was your biggest takeaway from my conversation with Carrie Jackson? For me, it was that the psychological aspects of injury recovery are often overlooked and can impact performance as much as physical recovery. Further, dealing with injuries can lead athletes to question their identity due to the loss of sport, whether short-term or long-term. My suggestion to young athletes is to think about how you can mentally prepare for injuries, which are often inevitable. I would also suggest considering mental skills training to aid in the injury recovery process. I want to thank Carrie for her kind generosity and the wisdom she shared with the Freshman Foundation community. You can learn more about Carrie on her website at carriejackson.com or her Instagram at Feed the Athlete. You can learn more about the Freshman Foundation on our website at freshmanfoundation.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you back soon for episode 24.
Mike Huber is the founder and owner of Follow the Ball Coaching, located in Fairhaven, New Jersey. He is a mental performance coach and business advisor dedicated to serving athletes just like you reach their full potential on and off the court. The Freshman Foundation is all about helping you get to the next level. For more information, follow along on Instagram at the Freshman Foundation. Please subscribe. Give us a like on iTunes, Spotify, leave a review, tell a friend. Most importantly, come back in 2 weeks, ready to get better.